They left her for dead in a place where the wind had teeth and the mountains were knives. They thought the storm would be her tomb, a fittingly anonymous end for the quiet woman who spoke of barometric pressure and seismic resonance, while they spoke of kill zones and fields of fire. They were wrong. They hadn't understood that for her, the storm was not an adversary. It was an instrument. When the survivors saw her again, walking out of the gale-force chaos she was supposed to be buried under, she was no longer the civilian geologist they had abandoned. She was Commander Thorne, and the mountain had given her back, not as a victim, but as its verdict. The air in forward operating base. Ethel was thin and sharp, a blade of cold honed on the jagged peaks of the Ascari Range. It was a place that felt temporary by design, a collection of sand-colored composite habitats and reinforced command tents clinging to a high plateau like a desperate prayer. The silence here was a physical weight, broken only by the incessant, low-frequency hum of the base's atmospheric scrubbers and the distant, grinding whisper of rock settling deeper into itself. The mountains were alive, a slow geological behemoth breathing around them, and Dr. Eris Thorne was the only one who seemed to be listening to its respirations. She sat at a makeshift workstation in the corner of the Tactical Operations Center, a space dominated by the hulking blue glow of holographic tactical displays and the restless energy of soldiers in body armor. Her own space was an island of quiet concentration. A series of seismic charts were layered on her datapad, their jagged lines like the cardiogram of a dying giant. She traced a finger along a particularly dense cluster of microfractures, her expression unreadable. To the others, she was an anomaly, a civilian attachment from the Geo-Survey Division, tasked with monitoring the range's notorious instability. She was small, unassuming, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. She moved with a liquid economy that was unnervingly silent, and she spoke so rarely that her voice, when it did emerge, was a surprise, low, calm, and stripped of all inflection. Her focus was on the data streaming in from a network of subsurface sensors she had spent the last 3 months installing. P waves and S waves, shear stress, lithostatic pressure. To her, these were not abstract concepts. They were the vocabulary of the mountain, a language that foretold its violent moods. The air in the talk smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the faint, metallic tang of nervous sweat. It was a scent she had learned to associate with the precipice of action, a precursor to noise and violence. Right now, however, the only tension was the one coiling in the rock beneath her feet. She could feel it, a subtle vibration that traveled up the legs of her chair, a dissonant chord in the earth's deep hum. The command tent's flap was thrust aside, and Captain Eva Rostova entered, bringing with her a blast of frigid air and an aura of brusque authority. Rostova was the commander of the 101st Pathfinders, the unit tasked with securing this volatile sector. She was a woman carved from the same hard granite as the surrounding peaks, with a jaw set in a permanent state of defiance, and a gaze that dismissed anything that couldn't be quantified by ammunition counts or enemy positions. She moved with the heavy, deliberate tread of someone who believed the world would yield to sufficient force of will. Her eyes swept the TOC, cataloging, assessing, and ultimately dismissing Thorne's quiet corner. "Status report." Rostova's voice was a blunt instrument, designed to hammer compliance out of the air itself. Sergeant Marcus Cole, a man whose weary competence was the quiet engine that kept the base running, stepped forward. "Perimeter secure, Captain. Long-range comms are experiencing some atmospheric distortion, but local channels are clear. The storm front the brass warned us about is still holding north, projected to miss our sector by 50 clicks. Rostova grunted, a sound of profound dissatisfaction. She thrived on conflict, on clear objectives and tangible enemies. The waiting, the watching, the silent pressure of the mountains. It grated on her. Her gaze fell on Thorn again, a flicker of irritation crossing her features. And the geologist, is she still listening to her pet rocks? The question was loud, performative, meant for the entire room. A few of the younger troopers snickered. Thorn didn't look up from her data pad. She made a final notation, her stylus moving with surgical precision, before turning her head slowly. Her eyes met Rostova's, and for a moment, the ambient noise of the TOC seemed to recede. "The rocks are speaking, Captain." Thorn's voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room. "They're telling me the barometric pressure is dropping at a rate inconsistent with a standard cyclonic system. The infrasound arrays are picking up a resonance signature I've only seen in simulations of catastrophic shear events." Rostova's lips tightened into a thin, dismissive line. She strode over to Thorn's station, looming over her. She glanced at the screen, at the incomprehensible squiggles and data streams, and scoffed. "Shear events, simulations. Doctor, out here, we deal with reality. Reality is a grid square, an enemy combatant, and a round in the chamber. Your academic theories are a waste of bandwidth." "This isn't a theory," Thorn stated, her tone unchanging. It was a simple declaration of fact. The pressure differential is creating an orographic lift that will channel the wind into these canyons. The Venturi effect will accelerate it to over 300 kilometers per hour. It won't be a storm. It will be a geological event. A shear wind. A shear wind, Rostova repeated the word, tasting it with theatrical contempt. "Sounds very dramatic. I'll be sure to note it in my log, right after I note that Patrol Obsidian is proceeding as scheduled at 0500. They'll be checking the Eastern Pass. Make sure you have your rock data ready for them." She turned away, her dismissal absolute. The incident was closed. Sergeant Cole lingered for a moment near Thorn's desk. He was a veteran of a dozen such outposts, and he had learned to recognize the difference between institutional arrogance and genuine expertise. He looked at the calm, focused woman, and then at the retreating back of his captain. He didn't understand the science, not a word of it, but he understood the quiet certainty in Thorn's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in the eyes of master bomb technicians and legendary snipers. The look of someone who saw the world on a level others couldn't perceive. "You're sure about this, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low. Thorn finally looked away from her screen, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, only a profound and weary clarity. "The mountain doesn't care if we're sure, Sergeant. It simply is." The pre-dawn briefing was a study in contrasts. The air in the briefing tent was thick with the smell of strong coffee and nervous energy. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, the stars still sharp and cold in the thin atmosphere. Captain Rostova stood before a holographic map of the Eastern Pass, her pointer stabbing at objective markers and rally points. Her voice was crisp, confident, a projection of absolute control. She spoke of fields of fire, enemy patrol patterns, and extraction protocols. Thorn stood at the back of the tent, a silent shadow among the armored soldiers. She had been summoned by Rostova, an act of petty power designed to underscore her irrelevance. When the tactical portion of the brief was over, Rostova turned, her eyes finding Thorn in the gloom. Dr. Thorne will now give us her geological forecast, she announced, her tone dripping with sarcasm. The message was clear. This was a formality, an indulgence of a civilian nuisance. Thorne stepped forward into the pale blue light of the holomap. She didn't look at Rostova. She looked at the faces of the soldiers who would be going out into the pass, men and women whose lives depended on the quality of their intelligence. She tapped a command into her datapad, and the tactical map was overlaid with a complex lattice of red and yellow lines, indicating seismic stress and fault zones. Your primary route, she began, her voice even and devoid of emotion, takes you directly across the Kestrel shear zone. My subsurface sensors show a significant increase in tectonic strain along this fault. The probability of a rock slide in the next 12 hours is over 70%. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. The secondary route runs along the base of the Widow's Needle. The granite there is highly friable, and my acoustic sensors are detecting high-frequency vibrations consistent with imminent exfoliation. A significant slab failure is not a possibility, it is a statistical certainty. A murmur went through the assembled soldiers. They understood rock slides and slab failures. That was tangible. That was a threat their armor couldn't stop. Rostova's face hardened. This was a direct challenge to her authority, a subversion of her carefully constructed plan. She stepped forward, planting herself between Thorne and the patrol. What you're seeing, people, is a textbook case of analysis paralysis. We could stand here all day and listen to the doctor's scary stories about pebbles and dust, or we can do our jobs. We have a mission. The enemy uses that pass to resupply. We are going to observe and interdict. We will stick to the plan. She turned to Thorne, her voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. Your job is to provide data, Doctor, not to question my operational planning. You are a civilian, a guest here. Do not forget that. The challenge was explicit, a public demarcation of rank and role. It was designed to humiliate, to put the scientist back in her box. Thorne's response was not what Rostova expected. There was no flustered defense, no angry retort. She simply held the captain's gaze, her own expression as placid and unyielding as the granite outside. The data indicates your plan will fail and your soldiers will die, she said. It was not an opinion. It was not a warning. It was a conclusion delivered with the flat, dispassionate finality of a coroner's report. The air in the tent became thick with unspoken tension. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They had been trained to follow orders, to trust the chain of command. But Thorne's quiet, chilling certainty had planted a seed of doubt. They looked from their furious captain to the unnervingly calm geologist. Rostova's face was a mask of fury. She had been publicly contradicted, her authority questioned not by a soldier, but by an academic. She saw Thorne not as a scientist providing critical intelligence, but as an obstacle, a symbol of the intellectual elitism she despised. She was about to lash out, to pull rank in the most brutal way, but Sergeant Cole chose that moment to clear his throat. "Captain," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the turbulent atmosphere. "Perhaps the doctor could point out a third route, one that avoids these geological issues." He was offering his commander a way out, a chance to incorporate the data without losing face. Rostova glared at him, her anger now redirected. But she saw the logic. To continue to ignore the warning now would look reckless, not strong. She spat out her assent. "Fine, Doctor. Find us a safe path through your haunted rock garden. But be quick about it. Obsidian Patrol moves out in 30 minutes, with or without your blessing." Thorne turned back to the map. She didn't acknowledge the concession or the insult. She simply worked. Her fingers flew across her data pad, her mind processing thousands of data points: slope angles, rock composition, wind vectors, seismic history. She was no longer just a geologist. She was a strategist, seeing the terrain not as a static landscape, but as a dynamic, four-dimensional battle space where the oldest force on the planet was a key player. After a long silence, she highlighted a thin, winding path that clung to the spine of a low ridge. "This route is suboptimal for cover," she stated. "It's exposed, but the bedrock is a single, solid mass of Precambrian gneiss. It will not move. It is the only safe way." Rostova stared at the highlighted route, a sneer on her face. "Exposed, of course. Thank you for your invaluable input, Doctor." She turned to the patrol leader. "You heard her. We take the scenic route. Move out." The soldiers filed out, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension. As Thorne turned to leave, Rostova stepped into her path. "This changes nothing," she hissed, her voice low enough that only Thorne could hear. "You got lucky. Don't ever undermine me in front of my people again." Thorne looked at the captain. For the first time, a flicker of something other than calm analysis appeared in her eyes. It was not anger. It was something colder, more ancient. It was pity. "It has nothing to do with you, Captain," she said softly. "The mountain is coming for us all. Your pride won't matter when it arrives." The crisis began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and settled deep in the bones. Patrol Obsidian, having taken Thorne's recommended route, was halfway to their objective when the sky began to change. The bruised purple of dawn did not lighten to blue. It curdled into a sickly, yellowish gray. The air grew heavy, static, and the incessant wind that scoured the plateau died completely. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. On the edge of the plateau, Thorne was calibrating a remote sensor node. She had insisted on joining the patrol, a request Rostova had granted with malicious glee, assigning her the task of servicing the furthest, most exposed sensor in the network. It was grunt work, a punishment for her earlier insubordination. But for Thorne, it was an opportunity. This particular sensor was a key piece of her array, a deep strata resonance monitor that was her only way to listen to the mountain's heart. She felt the pressure drop before the instruments registered it, a hollow feeling in her sinuses, a lightness in her blood. The animals, the hardy rock ptarmigans and the shy mountain goats, had long since vanished. The world was holding its breath. She looked at her wrist-mounted monitor. The readings were catastrophic. The barometric pressure was plummeting in a sheer, vertical drop. The infrasound signature was no longer a whisper. It was a scream just below the range of human hearing, but palpable as a physical vibration. "Captain Rostova," her voice over the comms was sharp, precise, stripped of all pleasantries. "This is Thorne. The event is imminent. I am reading a pressure gradient that is off the charts. You need to pull the patrol back to the FOB, now." Rostova's voice crackled back, laced with static and irritation. "We are on mission, Doctor. We are not turning back because your magic box got spooked. Finish your work and return to the rally point." "You don't understand," Thorne's voice was flat, urgent. "This isn't a storm you can wait out. The wind speed will exceed survivability in less than 10 minutes. The rock itself will start to fracture. This sensor is critical, but it's not worth your lives. Abort the mission." The first gust of wind hit then. It wasn't wind, it was a solid wall of air, a physical impact that threw her against the rock face. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The sky went from gray to black. Dust, ice crystals, and small pebbles were instantly airborne, a horizontal blizzard that scoured the landscape. "Captain," Sergeant Cole's voice shouted over the comms, strained with effort. "We have zero visibility. The wind is, my God, I've never seen anything like it." "All units, find cover," Rostova commanded, her voice tight with a dawning, unwelcome realization. "Thorn, what is this?" "It's the sheer wind," Thorn replied, her voice steady even as she braced herself against the gale. "I told you it was coming." She was working frantically on the sensor node, her fingers numb with cold, her movements sure and practiced. "I have to finish the calibration. The data from this event could save everyone at the base." "We don't have time for your science project," Rostova roared. "I'm ordering you to abandon the equipment and fall back to the rally point immediately. That's a direct order, Doctor." Thorn didn't hesitate. "Negative, Captain. The data is more important." The comms channel was silent for a moment, filled only by the screaming of the wind. Rostova was faced with a choice. Her entire career, her entire worldview, was built on the bedrock of obedience to the chain of command. To have a civilian, a woman she despised, openly defy a direct order in the middle of a crisis was unthinkable. It was a personal affront, a betrayal that overshadowed the existential threat of the storm. Her fear and confusion curdled into pure incandescent rage. "Fine." Rostova's voice was suddenly cold, brittle as ice. "You want to stay with your precious machine? You can die with it." She switched to the patrol's command channel. "All elements, this is Rostova. We are leaving her. Move to Rally Point Bravo. We will ride this out there. Move." "Captain, we can't just leave her," Cole protested, his voice barely audible over the gale. "I have given an order, Sergeant," Rostova shrieked. "Anyone who disobeys will be court-martialed. Now move!" Thorn heard the exchange. She felt a brief, cold pang, not of fear, but of disappointment. She finished the final sequence, and the sensor node's light blinked from red to a steady green. The data was streaming. She had done her job. She pulled her collar tight, wedged herself into a narrow crevice in the rock face, and prepared to meet the mountain's fury alone. The sounds of the patrol's retreat were swallowed by the storm. She was abandoned. Back at FOB Ethel, chaos reigned. The sheer wind descended on the base not as weather, but as a siege engine. The composite habitats groaned under the strain, their anchor bolts screaming in protest. The main communications tower, built to withstand hurricane-force winds, buckled and then tore away, its metal frame cartwheeling into the gray abyss. The base was cut off, blind and deaf. And then the enemy attacked. They came out of the storm like ghosts, their movements masked by the deafening roar of the wind and the seismic chaos that scrambled the base's perimeter sensors. They were the local insurgency, fighters who had been born in these mountains, who understood their rhythms and their violence. They had been waiting for the sheer wind, knowing it would be their shield. Rostova, having made it back to the FOB with the battered remnants of her patrol, found herself in a nightmare. Her textbook tactics were useless. Her soldiers couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them. The wind's acoustic properties played tricks on the ear, making a single rifle shot sound like it was coming from all directions at once. The enemy was using the storm, flowing with it, while her soldiers were fighting against it. She ordered suppressive fire, but it was a waste of ammunition, the bullets swallowed by the gale. She ordered squads to sweep the perimeter, but they were picked off one by an enemy they never saw. Her command, once so absolute, began to fracture. The soldiers, their faces etched with fear and confusion, looked to her for answers, but her eyes were blank. The situation was not in any manual. Her world of clear orders and predictable outcomes had been torn apart by a storm she had been warned about, and by an enemy who was part of the landscape. Her authority, built on a foundation of rigid certainty, crumbled into dust. The Teoki was a cacophony of panicked shouts, useless static, and the relentless, soul-crushing howl of the wind. Captain Rostova, the woman of iron will, was paralyzed. She had failed. The mountain did not kill her. It tested her, for Eris Thorn, alone in the screaming heart of the sheer wind. Survival was not a matter of endurance, but of understanding. She did not fight the storm. She became part of it. She used her knowledge of the rock to find a fissure that was shielded from the main force of the wind, a place where the gale's energy was diffracted and weakened. She monitored her biometrics, keeping her core temperature stable through controlled breathing, a technique she had learned in a place far colder and more desolate than this. The cold was a known variable, something to be managed. The wind was a complex equation of pressure and velocity, something to be solved. She listened, not with her ears, which were assaulted by the deafening roar, but with her whole body. She felt the vibrations in the rock, distinguishing the low-frequency shudder of the wind from the sharper, percussive impacts of enemy mortar fire hitting the FOB miles away. She analyzed the dust in the air, noting the high concentration of quartz and feldspar, telling her which strata of rock were being eroded by the storm and from which direction. She was not a victim in a storm. She was a sensor, gathering data from the heart of the chaos. When the peak of the sheer wind passed, leaving behind a still furious but manageable gale, she began to move. Her journey back to the FOB was a masterclass in environmental navigation. She moved from one rock outcropping to the next, using their shapes to predict and avoid the powerful eddies and downdrafts. She tasted the snow to gauge its age and stability, avoiding the newly formed cornices that hid treacherous drops. She was not a geologist walking through a storm. She was a predator, moving through its native terrain with lethal efficiency. She arrived at the perimeter of FOB Ethel to find a scene of utter devastation. The outer fences were torn to shreds. The ground was littered with debris and the dark shapes of the fallen. The sounds of sporadic, desperate gunfire echoed from the direction of the main command center. The enemy had breached the perimeter. They were inside. She didn't enter through the main gate. She circled to the western edge of the plateau, to a sheer cliff face that the base's designers had deemed impassable. To her, it was not a wall. It was a geological map. She saw the lines of fracture, the veins of harder basalt, the handholds and footholds invisible to any other eye. She climbed. Her movements were fluid, precise, a vertical ballet of muscle and knowledge. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She slipped over the edge of the plateau and landed silently behind a row of damaged supply containers. She moved through the chaos of the base like a ghost, her gray storm gear rendering her nearly invisible in the swirling dust and snow. The soldiers she passed, hunkered down and terrified, did not even see her. She was a phantom of the storm. The doors to the Tactical Operations Center had been blown from their hinges. Inside, the scene was one of abject failure. The holographic displays were flickering, showing corrupted data. Soldiers were shouting conflicting reports. In the center of it all stood Captain Rostova, her face pale, her eyes wide with the shock of a commander who had lost control. Sergeant Cole was trying to organize a defense, his face grim, but he was just one man in a sea of panic. Thorne stepped through the ruined doorway. She was a specter of ice and rock, her face streaked with grime, her clothes torn, but her eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. The howling of the wind seemed to die down as she entered. The frantic shouting faltered. Every eye in the room turned to her. They stared at the woman they had left to die, the quiet academic who had returned from the grave. Rostova gasped, her mind unable to process the sight. You're supposed to be dead." Thorne ignored her. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the tactical displays, the panicked faces, the map of their failure. Her mind was already working, processing, analyzing. She saw the enemy's strategy, how they were using the storm's acoustic dead zones to mask their approach. She saw the structural weaknesses in the base's layout that the enemy was exploiting. She saw the solution. She walked to the main holographic display, her boots making no sound on the debris-strewn floor. She wiped away the corrupted data with a single swipe of her hand, bringing up a clean topographical map of the base and the surrounding area. "Sergeant Cole," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the fear in the room. It was not a request. It was a command. Cole, stunned but recognizing the sudden shift in authority, snapped to attention. "Ma'am, get me a direct feed from the base's seismic sensors, all of them, and patch me into the fire control system for mortar teams Bravo and Charlie." Her orders were precise, counterintuitive. They weren't about fighting what they could see. They were about targeting what they couldn't. "What are you doing?" Rostova stammered, taking a step forward. "I am in command here." Thorne didn't even look at her. Her focus was absolute. Authority did not come from the rank on one's collar. It flowed to the person with the solution. In that moment of collective paralysis, her competence was the only thing that mattered. "Cole, now," Thorne repeated, her voice dropping a fraction, gaining an edge of cold steel that no one in the room had ever heard from her before. Sergeant Cole looked at his paralyzed captain, then at the impossibly calm woman who had walked out of the storm. He made his choice. "Yes, ma'am," he said, turning to the comms panel. He was the first to follow her. His compliance was a spark, and in the desperate, terrified minds of the other soldiers, it caught fire. One by one, they turned from Rostova and looked to Thorne, their new, unofficial commander. The hierarchy of rank had dissolved, replaced by a hierarchy of competence. The quiet geologist was now in control. "The enemy is using the storm as cover," Thorne began, her voice a steady, authoritative presence in the chaotic TOC. "They believe the wind's acoustic distortion makes them invisible. They're wrong. They're loud." She pointed to the topographical map, which now had the seismic data feed overlaid as a shimmering, pulsating grid. "Every footstep, every piece of equipment they move creates a seismic signature. The rock under our feet is a giant microphone, and I know how to listen." The soldiers stared at the map. To them, it was a meaningless light show. To Thorne, it was a perfect image of the battlefield. She could see the enemy moving, not as figures, but as clusters of vibration, as rhythmic pulses in the earth. "They're using the old mining tunnels to the north," she said, tracing a path on the map that wasn't visible on any tactical overlay. The vibrations are propagating through that dolomite seam. They think it's a covered approach. She turned to Cole. Give me fire control for Mortar Team Bravo. Cole complied instantly. A targeting reticle appeared on the map under Thorne's control. She didn't target the tunnel entrance. She targeted a point on the cliff face, 100 meters above it. "What are you doing?" a young lieutenant asked, his voice shaking. "You'll miss them by a mile." "I'm not targeting the enemy," Thorne replied without looking at him. "I'm targeting the mountain." She entered a series of coordinates. Targeting a specific point of instability in the gneiss formation. The percussive shock from the mortar impact will trigger a sympathetic resonance, causing a controlled rock slide. She tapped the command to fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a deep, grinding roar, far more powerful than any mortar explosion, echoed through the storm. On the tactical display, a massive section of the northern cliff face detached and cascaded downwards, a torrent of rock and ice that completely obliterated the tunnel entrance. The seismic signatures from that sector vanished. An entire enemy flank had been eliminated without a single shot fired at a human target. A stunned silence fell over the TOC. The soldiers looked from the screen to Thorne with a new expression. Awe. "They'll adapt," Thorne stated, her mind already moving to the next problem. "Their main assault is coming from the east, using the wind as an acoustic shield. We'll take that shield away from them." She turned to the communications officer. "I need you to broadcast a specific frequency across all external speakers. A low-frequency pulse, 1.5 hertz. Modulate it precisely." "Ma'am?" the officer asked, confused. "What will that do?" "The Eastern Canyon acts as a natural wind tunnel," Thorne explained, her eyes fixed on the map. "The wind speed and air density create a specific refractive index for sound. That low-frequency pulse, when broadcast into the gale, will create a phenomenon known as an acoustic shadow. To the enemy, it will sound like the storm has died down directly in front of them, while the sound to their flanks will be amplified. It will create an auditory illusion of a safe, quiet corridor leading directly into our kill zone. It was brilliant. It was insane. It was a form of warfare no one in the room had ever conceived of. They were no longer fighting soldiers. They were weaponizing physics. The pulse was broadcast. Thorne then directed the base's remaining heavy machine guns to focus on a narrow, seemingly empty sector of the eastern approach. "Fire on my command," she ordered. They waited. The tension in the room was a living thing. Then, on the thermal imagers, they appeared. A large force of enemy fighters, moving confidently, bunched together, drawn into the false silence of the acoustic shadow. They walked directly into the overlapping fields of fire. "Now," Thorne said, her voice as soft as falling snow. The machine guns opened up. The result was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The enemy force, caught completely in the open, was annihilated in seconds. One last group of signatures remained, clustered near the southern perimeter. They were dug in, using the ruins of the comms tower for cover. They were the enemy command element. "They're too well defended for a direct assault," Cole reported, his voice now filled with a quiet reverence for the woman he was serving. "We won't assault them," Thorne said. She looked at her wrist monitor, checking the storm's progress. "The shear wind is about to enter its final phase. The rapid temperature and pressure shifts will cause a massive buildup of static electricity in the atmosphere. The ion differential between the storm cloud and the ground will be in the millions of volts." She pointed to the twisted metal of the fallen comms tower on the map. "A perfect lightning rod." She made a final calculation, factoring in wind speed, humidity, and the metallic composition of the tower. She directed a single mortar team to fire one round, not an explosive round. A flare. Fire the flare directly over the tower, she commanded. The magnesium burn will create a superheated ionized path through the air, a channel for the lightning to follow. The flare arced into the black sky. For a second, it illuminated the hellscape of the base. Then, as it passed over the fallen tower, the sky itself seemed to split apart. A bolt of lightning, thicker than a man's body and blindingly white, leaped from the clouds to the tower. The explosion of energy was immense, a cataclysm of light and sound that shook the very foundations of the base. The enemy signatures around the tower vanished, not just from the seismic map, but from existence, and then silence. The roar of the sheer wind began to subside, its fury spent. The constant grinding vibration in the rock ceased. The only sound in the talk was the quiet hum of the electronics. The enemy was broken. The threat was neutralized. The siege was over. Eris Thorne stood before the map, her expression unchanged. She had not raised her voice. She had not fired a weapon. She had faced an overwhelming force, and she had defeated them by making the mountain itself her army, the storm her weapon, and the laws of physics her command. The soldiers around her no longer saw a civilian geologist. They saw a savior. They saw a legend born from the heart of the storm. The silence that followed the battle was deeper than the one that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with the weight of what had happened, of the impossible victory they had just witnessed. The storm, as if acknowledging the end of the conflict, began to recede, its world-ending howl diminishing to a mournful sigh. The first rays of a weak, watery sun broke through the oppressive gray clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across the battered FOB. A crackle of static from the long-range comms array, hastily repaired by a tech crew working with a desperate fervor, made everyone in the TOC jump. For hours there had been nothing but white noise. Now, a voice, distorted but clear, cut through. "Thel, this is Admiral Vance, Starcom Command. Do you read me? Over." Captain Rostova, who had been standing in the corner like a ghost at a feast, her authority stripped away, her face a mask of disbelief and humiliation, saw her chance. This was the institution reasserting itself. This was the return to the world she understood. She shoved her way to the comms panel. "Admiral Vance, this is Captain Rostova of FOB Ethel," she said, her voice straining to sound commanding and in control. "We have weathered the storm and repelled a major enemy assault. The base is secure." She paused, then her voice hardened with righteous fury. "Sir, I need to report a serious breach of protocol. Civilian attachment Dr. Eris Thorne disobeyed a direct order during the crisis, incited a mutiny among my personnel, and seized unauthorized command of this facility. I am formally requesting she be taken into custody pending a full court-martial." The comms channel was silent for a long, heavy moment. The soldiers in the room looked from Rostova's accusing face to Thorne, who stood calmly by the holographic map, studying a seismic aftershock as if the conversation didn't concern her at all. Then Admiral Vance's voice came back, and all the static was gone. It was cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of patience. It was a voice that did not brook argument. "Captain Rostova, you will stand down and you will shut your mouth. Is that understood?" Rostova recoiled as if struck. "Sir, I don't understand." "No, Captain, you clearly don't." Vance's voice was like chipping ice. "You had a Tier 1 asset on your base, A woman whose understanding of unconventional warfare is greater than the entire general staff's combined. And you treated her like a nuisance. You were given explicit warnings about a catastrophic environmental event, and you dismissed them because of your own arrogant ignorance. You abandoned a United States naval officer to die in that storm, Captain. The only reason you are not speaking to me from inside a body bag is because that same officer came back and saved you and your entire command from your own incompetence. The words fell like hammer blows in the silent room. United States naval officer, Tier 1 asset. The pieces began to click into place in the minds of the onlookers, their awe turning into a profound paradigm-shifting understanding. "Sir, that's impossible," Rostova whispered, her face ashen. "She's a geologist." "She is whatever the mission requires her to be, Captain," Vance retorted. "Today, her mission required her to be a geologist. As of the moment you abandoned her, her mission became yours." There was another pause, this one even more damning than the last. "Commander Thorne," the Admiral said, his tone shifting completely. It was now filled with a deep, unshakable respect. "Eris, report." Thorne finally turned from the map. She walked to the comms panel, took the handset from the stunned Sergeant Cole, and keyed the microphone. Her voice was the same as it had always been, calm, factual, economical. "Admiral, FOB Athol is secure. Enemy forces neutralized. We have sustained casualties and moderate structural damage. The shear wind has passed. I am assuming command until relief arrives." "Understood, Commander," Vance replied. "A relief column and a full investigation team are en route. Your discretion is authorized, as always." He paused. "And Eris, well done." "Just doing my job, sir," she said, and then switched off the channel. The revelation hung in the air, recontextualizing everything, every quiet observation, every piece of calm advice, every moment of unnerving competence. It hadn't been the eccentricity of an academic. It had been the quiet professionalism of an elite operator working deep undercover. Rostova stared at her, her mind broken. The woman she had mocked, dismissed, and left for dead was not only her superior in skill, but also, she now realized with sickening certainty, vastly her superior in rank. Her career wasn't just over. It was an object lesson in failure that would be taught for decades. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor, a captain in name only, her authority not just gone, but proven to have been an illusion all along. The reckoning was complete. In the days that followed, a new order settled over FOB Ethel. It was a quiet, efficient order driven by the calm gravitational pull of Commander Thorne's presence. She said little, issued few commands, but her intent was always clear. The soldiers worked with a renewed purpose, clearing debris, tending to the wounded, and reinforcing defenses, not out of fear, but out of a deep and profound respect. They no longer saw the unassuming woman with the datapad. They saw the architect of their salvation. They gave her a wide berth, speaking in hushed tones when she passed, as if she were a force of nature, like the storm she had commanded. Thorne, for her part, seemed oblivious to the awe she inspired. She showed no pleasure in her victory, no satisfaction in Rostova's disgrace. The former captain was confined to her quarters, awaiting the arrival of the investigation team, a non-entity in the functioning of the base she once commanded. Thorne's focus was already on the next phase, cataloging the geological data from the shear wind, analyzing the enemy's tactics, and preparing a full after-action report that would be a masterpiece of clinical, brutal honesty. She was a professional, and the job was not yet done. One afternoon, as Thorn stood on the edge of the plateau, looking out at the mountains that were now calm and sun-drenched, Sergeant Cole approached her. He did not offer praise or thanks. He knew instinctively that such things were meaningless to her. Instead, he held out a piece of rock he had picked up from the rockslide she had caused. It was a piece of gneiss, streaked with veins of shimmering mica schist. "Commander," he said, the title now feeling natural on his tongue. "I was wondering, what are these shiny bits, the way they fracture? It's not like the rest of the rock." Thorn took the rock from him. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the layers of compressed, metamorphosed minerals. She looked at Cole, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. He wasn't asking to ingratiate himself. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand. He had learned the ultimate lesson of the Shearwind, that knowledge was the true source of power. "It's muscovite," she said, her voice soft. "A type of mica. It forms under immense heat and pressure, aligning itself along the plane of lowest stress. It's what makes the rock weak. It's the fault line. You just have to know how to see it." She handed the rock back to him. Cole nodded slowly, looking at the stone in his hand with new eyes. It was the quietest, most profound acknowledgement she could have received. It was a sign that the cultural shift was complete. Logic had triumphed over ego. Competence had replaced rank. A week later, a heavy transport shuttle descended from the sky, its engines a stark contrast to the natural silence of the range. It brought with it a new commander, a team of investigators, and fresh supplies. Thorn met them, handed over a datapad containing her full report, and then, with her small bag of personal effects, she boarded the departing craft. She had arrived as a geologist, and she left as a geologist. The legend she left behind was for others to tell. As the shuttle climbed, she looked down one last time at the jagged peaks of the Ascari Range. They were just mountains, a complex system of rock and ice, pressure and time. They held no malice and offered no praise. They simply were, and she, in her own way, was the same, a quiet, professional force, moving through the world, her purpose not to be lauded or even understood, but simply to be effective. The storm was over, the job was done, and somewhere else, another mountain was waiting to speak to her.